Book 4, Chapter 4, Part 2 of the History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 2, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 4, Organization, Chapter 4, Part 2, Limpieza. Thus far, there does not seem to have been any definite system adopted as to verifying limpieza. The Statute of Toledo required aspirants to furnish genealogies and deposit money for expenses, and this was probably the common plan. In 1557, we are told of Beltran Ibanez de Arzamendi, appointed alguacil in the Tribunal of Sardinia, that the examination of his paternal genealogy was made in Valencia, and of his maternal in Calahorra, the birthplaces of his respective parents, but doubtless much of this was perfunctory. It is evidently felt that the highest authority must be invoked to prescribe a settled system, and Philip II was called upon for this. In 1562 he accordingly issued a decree in which, according to custom, antiquity was claimed for innovation, for it recited that, since the Inquisition had been founded in Castile and Aragon, all inquisitors and officials appointed by the Inquisitor-General had been required to furnish genealogies to prove that there was no trace of descent from Jews or Moors, or from those condemned or penanced by the Inquisition. The king therefore ordered that all appointees in tribunals of the kingdoms of the crown of Aragon and of Navarre, and of Logroño, should furnish satisfactory proofs of limpieza, even though they might hold canonries or churches or be members of orders which required limpieza. Moreover, married men were obliged to furnish proofs of the limpieza of their wives, and those already in office were to be dismissed if there was defect of limpieza in the wife. These rules were to be embodied in the instructions, and were to be inviolably observed. Undoubtedly a similar order was issued for Castile, and the utterance is important as embodying the first absolute demand for proofs of limpieza, and as marking the extravagant extension of the rule to wives. This royal cedula was interpreted as applicable to existing incumbents, and investigations as to their genealogies were set on foot, with the intention of weeding out at least the familiars who were not limpios. Several efforts had already been made to this effect under the Castile Concordia of 1553, without apparent result, and it was now undertaken again, with instructions that, if any were found to be conversos, they were to be dismissed without assigning a reason. It was a work ungrateful both to the investigators and investigated, and dragged along in the most perfunctory fashion. Cartas acordadas in 1567 and 1575 called for lists of those who had been investigated and those who had not, and, when it came to taking action, the habitual tenderness manifested toward officials was displayed in orders issued in 1572 and again in 1582, that if any officials, commissioners, or familiars were found lacking in the requisite qualifications, they were to be reported to the Suprema without dismissing them. As a matter of course, the test was applied to all new appointments, and no one was admitted to office in any capacity in the Inquisition who was not free from the mancha of Jewish or Moorish blood, or of ancestral punishment. Even for temporary employment, limpieza was essential. In his visitation of the Canaries in 1574, the Inspector Bravo de Zayas brought an accusation against the Inquisitor Ortiz de Funes of appointing officials without preliminary investigation, the cases being two emergency appointments to fill temporary vacancies, and the appointees being montañeses, or highlanders from the northern provinces of Spain, where purity of blood was presumable, to say nothing of the fact that an investigation would probably have consumed a year or two. Yet this was but the natural expression of the infatuation which had taken possession of Spain. In 1595, Philip II, in his instructions to Manrique de Lara, lays a special stress on the importance of limpieza. Investigation as to this and as to habits must be made with the utmost rigor, and no dispensations must be granted. No examinations are to be made before the party is selected, because otherwise, if he is not appointed owing to other reasons, it may be ascribed to a mancha, and thus undeserved infamy be cast upon an entire kindred. Strangely enough, however, the Inquisitor-General himself was never required to furnish proofs of purity of blood. Unfortunately, in the craze for absolute limpieza, no limit was set to the number of generations through which the taint could be carried. The canon law, as we have seen, limited disabilities to grandchildren, and in 1573 Leonardo Donato describes the rule as extending to what were called the four quarters, that is, the parents and the four grandparents, and in this moderate shape he says it was the cause of constant strife and of preserving the old Judaizing memories. In this, however, he greatly understated Spanish craving for purity of blood. We have seen the Cortes of Castile, in 1532, petition that it should be satisfied with great-grandparents, indicating that it was carried beyond this, and Silicio's Toledo statute affixed no limit. Each body, it is true, could prescribe its own rules, but the more important ones discarded all limitations and refused admission to those against whom a stain could be found, however remote. In 1633 Escobar informs us that among these were included the Inquisition, the orders of Santiago, Alcantara, Calatrava, and St. John, the Church of Toledo, and all the greater colleges and universities, including that of Alcalá. These also required the most rigorous investigation to trace out the slightest mancha in the remotest grade of parentage. There were two sources of descent which caused impurity of blood: from an ancestor of either of the proscribed races, or from one who had ever been penanced by the Inquisition. As regards the former, the line was drawn at the massacres of 1391 for Jews, and at the enforced baptisms of the early 16th century for Moors. Voluntary converts, prior to these periods, were accepted as old Christians; the subsequent ones were considered as unwilling converts, and were regarded as new Christians, together with their descendants, no matter how zealously they had embraced the Christian faith. The prevalence of intermarriage with conversos throughout the 15th century had led to infinite ramifications throughout the land in the course of generations, and, about 1560, Cardinal Mendoza y Bobadilla, apparently moved by some discussion on limpieza, drew up and presented to Philip II a memorial in which he showed that virtually the whole nobility of Castile and Aragon had a strain of Jewish blood. There was no lack of material for tracing the dissemination of this blood through the land. In Aragon, Juan de Anchias, the zealous secretary of the first Saragossa tribunal, compiled what was known as the Libro Verde de Aragon, giving the affiliations of all the leading conversos who had suffered, so as to serve as a beacon for all who desired to avoid contamination. In Castile there was no such authoritative publication, but the records of the tribunals had accumulated ample material, and the sanbenitos of the relaxed and reconciled, hung in the parish churches, kept the memory of the sufferers green, to the discomfiture of their descendants. Many individuals, moved by zeal or by malignity, from these and other sources, with greater or less exactness, and including much that was mere idle hearsay, compiled books which were circulated under the name of Libros Verde or del Becerro. No one of the upper or middle class, except in the remote mountainous districts of the north and east, could feel secure that an investigation might not reveal some unfortunate mésalliance of a distant ancestor. In fact, only those could feel safe whose obscurity precluded any prolonged search into their ancestry. As a writer remarks, in 1627, if it were not for limpieza, the Inquisition could select the best men for familiars, in place of appointing the low-born, whose ignorance enables them to pass the examinations successfully. The second source of impurity, descent from one penanced by the Inquisition, originally applied only to those who had incurred the heavier penalties of relaxation or reconciliation, but there was nothing to check the scrupulosity of the examiners, who worked in secret, and they came to regard any penance inflicted by the Holy Office as affixing an indelible stigma on the descendants. The results of this were forcibly described in a memorial presented, in 1631, to Philip IV by Dr. Diego de Silva, a member of the Suprema. After alluding to the greatly increased rigor of investigation, dating from the later years of Philip II, he proceeds to state a farther source of wrong only appreciable by one who has handled the records of the Inquisition, and not to be openly mentioned. In contrast to the exquisite justice and benignity which he ascribes to the existing tribunals, the proceedings in the former period were hurried and violent. Many, to save their lives, made confessions which may have been groundless. Whole districts were reconciled rather as a spiritual than a judicial process. In that dangerous period, careless words and propositions created suspicion, and people were tried and dismissed with some trivial penance, a few masses, some almsgiving, or a light fast, for offences belonging really to the exterior forum. Yet all these were sentences, and as there has since grown up the rule requiring immemorial limpieza, whole families were branded with infamy. As, in fact, since the Reformation, the Inquisition had grown more and more exacting, and had inflicted on Old Christians innumerable penances for careless words, it is easy to conceive how this rigorous definition of limpieza spread infection throughout the land, even outside of those who had a drop of Jewish or Moorish blood. These evils were aggravated by the looseness with which adverse testimony was admitted in the investigations. Anonymous communications were received and acted upon, for, although this was prohibited by law and by papal briefs, these were commonly disregarded. In a decree by Philip IV, in 1623, designed to curb some of the evils, it was ordered that no weight be attributed to idle talk, but the diffuseness with which Escobar, in his commentary on this section, dwells upon the worthless character of scandal and idle gossip and angry words uttered in quarrels, shows how largely such evidence entered into the conclusions reached. Common fame or reputation, he tells us, suffices, even if the grounds for it be unknown, and purity or impurity of blood is for the most part a matter of common fame and belief. That this is so is seen in the elaborate series of instructions for the conduct of such investigations, where the fiscal is warned that great weight is to be given to such expressions of opinion, even though the witness can offer no proof except that he has heard it from his elders. The avenue thus opened to the malignant to gratify hatred is dwelt upon by the writer with too much insistence for us to question the frequency with which it was utilized. This was facilitated by the secrecy which shrouded these investigations. The applicant put in his genealogy, named his witnesses, and awaited the event. The process at best was a deliberate one, and, if the result was unfavorable, the answer never came, though the failure to secure an appointment might arise from any other cause. As Dr. Silva says, the silence and mysterious authority of the Inquisition will not give the slightest glimmer of light to the applicant, even through 20 years of suspense, though meanwhile the opinion gains ground that his family is impure, without his being able to rebut or investigate it, and thus a whole lineage suffers with all its kindred. A glimpse into the anxieties thus caused is afforded by a consulta of February 26, 1634, from the Inquisitor-General to the king, respecting a memorial from the Marquis of Navarrese asking for a speedy decision for his son, Don Francisco Gurrea y Borja, who had put in his proofs for an appointment as familiar, as the delay is damaging to his reputation. The Inquisitor-General reports to the king that no conclusion had been reached. Perhaps the king may please to decide it, for the Marquis has been in court for a long time pressing the matter, and the delay has brought upon him suffering and stigma. The suspense endured by all the kindred, when one of its members decided to undergo the ordeal, is visible in a letter of 1636 from Fernando, Archbishop of Cuzco, to his nephew, the Coronel Jacinto de Vera, on learning that he was about to apply for admission to one of the military orders. He gives him advice and information, and so important did he consider it that he had 7 copies made, to be forwarded by different routes and vessels, and another member of the family wrote to Jacinto earnestly cautioning him not to let any eye but his own fall upon the Archbishop's letter. In the routine adopted by the Inquisition for these investigations, the applicant handed in his genealogy, and, if married, that of his wife, giving the names and residences of parents and grandparents. If thorough search through the registers, by names and districts, revealed a fatal blot, that of course was sufficient. If not, commissioners or secretaries with notaries were sent from the tribunal, or the nearest commissioners were ordered to go to the places of residence, where from 8 to 12 of the most aged old Christians of good repute were summoned as witnesses, with precautions to prevent the interested parties from knowing who was called upon. The witnesses were examined under oath, on a series of printed interrogatories, as to their knowledge of the parties, whether they were descended from conversos or from penitents, what were the sources of information, and whether it was public fame and report. The replies were duly taken down and attested. If salaried officials or familiars were concerned, the results of the information were transmitted to the Suprema, to which were also referred doubtful questions and votes in discordia. In a more perfected form, known as the Nueva Orden, in use in the 17th century, stringent additional precautions were taken to prevent the insufficient secrecy observed by officials, which was supposed to deter witnesses from giving adverse evidence. A Carta Acordada of January 22, 1628, threatened excommunication and deprivation of office for this, and, under subsequent regulations, all concerned were forbidden, under rigorous penalties, to reveal to anyone, even to a minister of the Inquisition, any evidence taken, or papers or records or even the name of a witness, so that the applicant should be kept in perfect ignorance of the progress of his affair. The commissioners were invested with full power to cite witnesses, to examine into sanbenitos suspended in churches, and to demand any papers bearing upon questions that might arise, whether these were in private hands or public archives, and at their discretion to make copies or carry away the originals, the owners of which were told that if they wanted them back they might apply to the tribunal. If a witness absented himself, a summons to appear before the tribunal was left with the parish priest to be served on him when he should return. Evidently no family records were too sacred to escape these searching investigations. All this, of course, involved expense, and the fees earned in the work by the officials formed a welcome source of revenue. In 1625 the pay of notaries or secretaries was fixed at a per diem of 16 reales. This was subsequently raised, for in 1665 a statement of expenses in the case of Dr. Martin Roig, applicant for the position of consultor in Valencia, shows that the secretary was paid 30 sueldos a day and a local commissioner 20. This was only part of the cost, for every act and every blank filled in, every piece of writing bore its separate charge. The bill rolled up for him and his wife in Barcelona for this unsalaried position amounted to 955 2/3 sueldos, and this was only the beginning. Similar researches were required in the tribunals of Valencia and Cuenca, which must have been still more costly, for the Barcelona report only occupied 23 folios, while that of Valencia was in 90, and one against his son Vicente was in 108. 2 years later, in 1667, the affair was still dragging on. It was a large price for the honor of an unpaid position, even if he proved successful. These extortions were multiplied as often as possible. In 1661, Juan Temprado Munoz made his proofs as receiver of the Tribunal of Murcia, and of course this included his wife, but when, in 1667, their son Juan Temprado de Serena desired an office in the Tribunal of Barcelona, he had to go through the same process afresh, when the examination of the Barcelona registers alone cost him 546 sueldos. In addition to this, the registers of Cuenca and Valencia had to be examined, and evidence had to be taken in the home of his ancestors. This chanced to be in Roussillon, which was now French territory. There was a war between the nations, and, even in peace, France refused entrance to officials of the Inquisition, so the ingenious formality was devised of sending a commissioner to the border and examining there the requisite number of old men as witnesses. The evidence of course was valueless, but it gathered in the per diem all the same. In time this per diem for the secretary was increased to 50 reales, and, from one or two cases in 1815, it appears that it was a perquisite which the secretaries took in turns, and, when the commissioner nearest to the place of examination was employed, it was without prejudice to the secretary; that is, the commissioner who did the work received 30 reales a day, while the secretary took the other 20. In order to secure the payment of these fees, the applicant was required, when he presented his genealogy, to make a deposit, originally of 300 reales. As the business increased, it became evident that a separate fund and separate accounts of these moneys must be kept, and in 1600 it was ordered that a special chest be provided, with 2 keys, one entrusted to the fiscal and the other to a secretary. Abuses crept in, effectively described in the memorial of 1623 to the Suprema, as a remedy for which a new official was created, known as the Depositario de los Pretendientes, who received and accounted for the deposits, charging 2% on the sums passing through his hands. This he remitted to the Suprema, for his office was salaried, and he was relieved of the temptation to perquisites. The office was one of those put up for sale, for 3 or 4 lives, under Sotomayor. The whole business was provocative of fraud and perjury and bribery. Despite the well-meant efforts of the Inquisition to preserve the profoundest secrecy, the writers of the period are too unanimous in deploring the success of enemies in casting infamy on those they hated, for us to doubt that means were found to ascertain what was on hand, and to abuse the opportunity. To the applicants the stake was too great for them to shrink from any means that promised success. Cases became not infrequent in the records of prosecutions for false witness in matters of limpieza, showing that aspirants were not remiss in furnishing testimony to prove fraudulent claims. Although, in 1560, Valdés humanely ordered that descendants of penitents, who committed perjury in getting up statements of limpieza, should not be prosecuted, this policy changed in 1577, when they were subjected to prosecution, and in 1582 the thrifty plan was adopted of inflicting pecuniary penance. This proved profitable, for the culprits were many, not only among aspirants to office, but because limpieza was requisite in many careers, and the Inquisition took cognizance of all cases of perjury in this matter, whether it was concerned or not in the investigation. Thus, in 1585, Bernardino de Torres, a prominent citizen of Toledo, had occasion in a suit to prove his nobility and purity of blood, which he did with a number of witnesses. The tribunal had evidence in its records that, on both father's and mother's side, he was descended from conversos who had been penanced, and it promptly prosecuted both him and his witnesses. Among them was the regidor of Toledo, Diego de Paredes, who had likewise sworn to his own limpieza, although the records showed his descent from reconciliados in a time of grace. Altogether there were 16 witnesses, the advanced age of most of them showing that old men found profitable occupation in testifying to their recollections. Bernardino himself was penanced in 50,000 maravedis. Many of the witnesses were let off with perpetual disability to testify in such cases, but 136,000 maravedis were collected from the rest. A few other Toledo cases at the same time may be mentioned to show the various motives impelling men to these frauds. Jerónimo de Villarreal desired to place his daughter in a convent where limpieza was required. The licenciado Antonio de Olvera was about to emigrate to the colonies, and wished to protect himself from insult. Hernando de Villarreal had a son who proposed to take orders, and another who aspired to an appointment as familiar. The records showed them to be descended from grandparents or great-grandparents who had been burnt or reconciled, and they were duly punished. The taint spread with every new generation, and a large part of the population was heavily handicapped in life. If there were frequent perjury and subordination of testimony, it is not to be supposed that the seekers for limpieza hesitated to corrupt the officials who controlled their destinies, nor is it unreasonable to assume that many of the latter were accessible to bribery. The opportunities were tempting, and they were freely exploited. An experienced writer, in 1648, describes this as the most troublesome business in the tribunals, leading to quarrels, which he hints arose between those honestly endeavoring to discharge their duty and those who had been bribed. The fiscal is reminded that he must set his face like flint against all efforts to pass a genealogy in which there is a flaw, for the aspirants tempt the officials, there is collusion between them, and forged documents are to be expected. The chief reason, he says, why commissionerships are sought is because of the opportunities thus afforded, and, writing in Toledo, he declares that all the commissioners and notaries attached to that tribunal are untrustworthy and venial. It was natural that the evils with which this absurd cult of limpieza afflicted the land should arouse opposition and call forth suggestions to mitigate its hardships. The earliest writer who ventured publicly to urge a reform seems to have been Fray Agustin Saludo, a distinguished Dominican theologian. In 1599 he issued a brief tract, pointing out that practically all Spaniards in the course of ages had contracted some more or less infinitesimal impurity of blood, and that, unless investigations were limited to some moderate period, such as 100 years, only the lower orders, whose genealogies were untraceable, could escape the consequences. He tells us that both Pius V and Gregory XIII drew up briefs prescribing narrow limits to these investigations, but that, on communicating their designs to Philip II, discussions arose as to the term, which proved so protracted that the briefs were never published. Philip himself became convinced of the necessity of some limitation, and, towards the close of his reign, he assembled a junta, including Inquisitor-General Portocarrero, 1596–99, which unanimously agreed to a term of 100 years, but Philip's death caused the project to be dropped. Solucio's tract was promptly suppressed by Philip III, but it was reprinted in 1637 by Fray Jeronimo de la Cruz with a verbose confutation. Yet, while he indignantly denied the aspersion on the limpieza of the nation, he was fully alive to the misery caused by the current practice, and he urged a limitation of time, placing it at 1492, the year of the expulsion of the Jews. End of Book 4, Chapter 4, Part 2.